Hello there, Thando Book Club lovers. We are so happy to have you join us as we talk to African female authors about their books and the stories behind them. As is our custom, we always begin every episode with a quote from a famous African that we believe captures the spirit and message of the author we'll be interviewing. Today's quote is from Wally Soyinka. The greatest threat to freedom is the absence of criticism. This quote sums up what our guest today champions in her work and in her book, A Seed in the Dust. Meet Ruramai Nyadzayo Mugwisi. Ruramai is a published author, blogger, social entrepreneur working to raise awareness of different issues affecting women and girls in her community. A poet, spoken word artist, digital content creator, medical laboratory scientist, wife and mother to 4 amazing children, Ruramai is a devoted Christian and passionate about purposeful and mindful living. Ruramai, welcome.
Hi, Selena. Thank you very much.
We're so glad to have you here with us, and you just look absolutely gorgeous today.
Thank you. You look lovely yourself.
Okay, so getting straight into the interview, why did you start writing?
So I believe in the power of storytelling because storytelling for me is a very critical part of human growth and development. With stories, we find representation, and representation is really critical in identity formation and character development. And so it became something that I was really passionate about because I wanted to write a story where others could also see themselves and hear themselves, giving a voice to those who perhaps felt voiceless. So that's basically the reason why I started writing.
And representation is so powerful because, like you said, it helps us form identity. But I think within those plural identities, a culture forms, a society finds itself and is able to kind of have a conversation with context and time and place and like the issues of the day. Now, your book is a memoir, but it's a different kind of memoir. So typically people write memoirs about themselves, but you're writing a memoir about a true and living person, and it's a true story, but
Yes.
You actually don't use their real name. You've changed the names, but the story is set in the real world, actual events of history and time. And so very much a memoir in that sense. Why did you choose this particular genre and form?
So because I love a good story, I love a story that follows a particular theme, it became a natural choice for me to settle on a memoir as the framework for the story that I wanted to write. And because I knew the themes that are in the story would resonate with a lot of people, because it presents an opportunity for us to see ourselves in a way that perhaps we do not permit ourselves to project ourselves out there to other people. It allows us to identify with certain thoughts, feelings, and emotions and behaviors that we may harbor secretly. You know, we have deep desires, secret yearnings that we cannot talk about, but this book explores them all. And though it may be a little bit controversial, but it allows everybody to see themselves through the lens of a character that's in a book and be able to recognize why they are the way they are and why they feel the way they feel. So it became a very natural choice for me to choose a memoir.
Definitely, and I love that choice. Personally, I prefer non-fiction. I feel like real life has a lot of creativity to it already, a lot of drama to it already, and is already quite interesting and captivating and fascinating. So I love that you chose to write a memoir and to write a true story. And I love what you said about it allows us to project and see ourselves differently. For me, what's really special about the book is that you're telling a Zimbabwean story. You're talking about Zimbabwean history. You're talking about Zimbabwean themes over a period of time. So I really, really appreciate that. And I don't think there's enough storytelling, that's moving Zimbabwe forward, from the stories that we've known and loved from a certain period of time. So I really, really like that. But before we get into the themes of the book, just tell us a little bit about what your writing process looks like.
Okay, so my writing process begins with connection. I need to connect to an idea or to a topic or an issue, and I find the best way to do that is it's beautifully put by Dr. Terai Trent in her book, The Awakened Woman, when she asks the question, what grieves your heart? So when I make a connection with an idea or a thought, generally it's something that is on my heart because it grieves my heart. It pushes me to want to do something about that particular theme or issue. And so the first thing is recognizing what grieves my heart, and then connecting with the idea emotionally, and then connecting with the idea intellectually. And at this point, I need to get into research. It's really important for me to be able to develop the idea thoroughly, gain an understanding of it, because I think that writing on a good theme or a good subject without doing proper research or very little research is like offering a meal in exquisite settings. You draw us in with the promise of dealing with a really good and powerful theme, but then you completely and absolutely spectacularly let us down by not delving into depth with the content. So research becomes a really, really important part of my writing process. I'm not seeking to become an expert, but I'm seeking to gain understanding, and understanding is just the ability to discern what the issue is about so that it informs my next action, what I need to do about it. After the research, we get on with the writing.
Wow. So let me stop you there. But that's really fascinating what you've talked about, and the analogy you used about a meal. Now, we'll be taking a short break, but we'll be right back in a few minutes to discuss the book, A Seed in the Dust, and you'll be able to see how that writing process comes out in the themes of the book that Ruramai has written. So stay tuned. Welcome back. We're in the studio with Ruramai, Nyadzayo, Mugwisi, and we're discussing A Seed in the Dust, an African memoir. So, this book packs in a lot of time, an iconic time for us as Zimbabweans. It's the story of Shumi and her journey and trajectory through life. But through that story, we see the story of a nation. One of the landmark times that is kind of sets up the book is the turn of independence. And we see that through the lens of her father and some of the issues he's dealing with that cause him to make some very unfortunate choices in his trajectory as a character. Shumi originates from a typical African Zimbabwean family, but then there's also the journey of the family she makes for herself through the book. Now, we've got seasons, we've got people who are difficult to understand, whom we then begin to understand, and then we've got personal responsibility and choice all in this story. So earlier you were telling us about your writing process, the research, and then you get down into the writing. What was that like for you now in terms of bringing Shumi to life as a character, especially because she's a real person? How were you managing that journey?
Okay, so if I were to provide a tagline for what Shumi's story is all about, and essentially what the book is about, it would be, it's a story about an ordinary girl who becomes an extraordinary woman accidentally. It's a story about people, and people are you and me, people are us. And so it's a story about our failures and our fearlessness. It's a story about our pain, and it's a story about our power. And so because it's a story about our humanness, I could connect with Shumi on that level, because we are not always the heroes in our own stories. Sometimes we're the heroes, sometimes we're the villains in our own life stories. So essentially it's looking at our imperfections and allowing those imperfections to project themselves, but also extending grace to ourselves to allow us to thrive as we are striving to become better, to do better, and to live better. So it was essentially just tapping into the psyche of my own life, although I tried my best to not contaminate her voice with my voice, because she is a living human being who did make her own choices. And the point was not to write a perfect story about a perfect woman, but to write an imperfect story about a flawed woman who went beyond her limits.
That's very powerful. I do think, even with all of Shumi's flaws and the imperfect story, a lot of beauty is created by tracing how she deals with that, how she confronts herself.
Absolutely.
And how she learns to make better choices, and how she ends up having an impact beyond herself, and even the themes of love, and how that plays out in her life. It just brings to life that there are many different love stories that can
Indeed.
appear at different times in our lives. You never know what will happen, and I really, really love that. So while she's imperfect, or there's imperfection in the story, a lot of beauty comes out of that imperfection. And I think Shumi is actually a very sympathetic character, which obviously then makes her very attractive you want to root for her. You want things to work out well for her. Something that I find very interesting in your book is these recurring theme around silence. And if I'm looking at page 23 of your book, there's this powerful statement that I just have to read out, where you write, "Our conscience must awaken to the seductive solve of holding our peace when there is no peace offered to those who suffer as a result of our silence. I understand now that silence against a wrong is complicity and willful participation in an injustice against the victim." And that's a recurring theme that's in the book, silence and voice. So in the beginning, Shumi is grappling with silence, and she's witnessing violence in her life, and experiencing it indirectly and the effects and the trauma of it. Yes. But during the course of her life, she finds or regains or establishes that voice through actions she takes, choices she makes, and the impact she then has on the world around her. Why is silence and voice such a powerful theme for you to explore, especially because you are so passionate about women and girls?
Exactly. We live in a world where a lot of controversial issues, which we should be confronting and tackling, are shrouded in secrecy and silence. And we allow that silence to take place because we don't like the change, we don't like confrontation, we don't like to rock the boat. But what do we sacrifice in exchange for the silence? We sacrifice our sanity, we sacrifice our mental health, we sacrifice our children, because the silence takes place everywhere. It's in our homes, it's in our schools, it's in our workplaces, and it's in churches where we expect to find freedom. And so the silence follows us, and it becomes the root cause of our lack of healing in spite of the passage of time, simply because there's so much silence after the injury, so healing cannot take place. So it's absolutely important for us to have the courage and the boldness to be able to make a sound, to try and reclaim our power, because shame silences us, but being vulnerable gives us our voice back. Depression silences us, but therapy gives us our voice back. Like you mentioned, the violence and the associated trauma that people face in their homes, it silences them, but collective action and justice gives us back our voice. So we need to strip away and pull away at the gags and the restraints that are holding us back, and be able to stand up in full power simply by finding our voice.
That's powerful, Ruramai. And it makes me think of two things in particular with regards to the book that you've written and Shumi's story, which is that the violence that she witnessed was a result of her own father's silence over his trauma. And that violence was almost the voice of the pain that could not speak, the wounds that were crying out but could not be heard. And it was like there was nowhere else to go. But then Shumi's iteration and actualization around that theme in her own life, and what she then goes on later to do, speaks very much to what you're talking about, collective action and justice. So it's not just people speaking about their traumas, everybody has voice in the story of healing. And throughout the continuum of how healing takes place, there are activists in society who must speak out and almost be like those biblical watchmen on the walls crying out against an injustice. But justice must also speak within the systems and structures of law and order. And then, the healers must also speak and listen and give space for pain and violence and wounds that come from violence to be heard, so that they can be soothed and settled down. So I think that's very powerful and a very amazing way to do that, just telling simply the story of a person's life. It gives us all an opportunity to think about those things and reflect on them for ourselves, because also through that we see that theme in the story of a nation. But right now we're just going to take a quick break. Powerful insights there for us all to ponder. It's time for another short break, but we'll be right back in a moment, and Ruramai is going to give us advice about publishing. And you definitely don't want to miss this, especially if you're thinking about giving voice to your own story through a non-fiction format like memoir. So stay tuned. You're watching the Thando Book Club, and we're interviewing Ruramai Nyadzayo Mugwisi. You're just in time to get some good advice on publishing and writing, and we can't wait to jump back into this conversation. So Ruramai, what did you learn about publishing from this process of putting together this book?
Okay, so the first thing that I had to learn was that there was a lot of learning that needed to take place. There was so much that I did not know, and I had to give myself the space and the room to be able to learn these new things and seek advice and guidance from other writers, other people who are in the industry. And then the second thing that I needed to do was to also to give up creative control at some point of the project. And this is very hard to do for creatives, because our projects become like our children. But we have to trust the process, and we have to trust the people that we are handing the project over to. And in this context, I'm talking about things like outsourcing editorial work, design, layout, formatting, all those things that you may not really have an understanding about. It is important for you to be able to learn about it, but you may not have the technical expertise and know-how. And so you need to be able to trust your voice and to be able to trust the voices of others that are there to help you. And then once you have produced and you have your book, do not think that you are done. Actually, that's when the real work begins, because the power of your story is in the way it will impact and influence the people that are going to read it. So you need to get your book out there. You need to sell. And, being creatives, we tend to try and leave that for someone else to take care of. But because you're the voice that wrote this story, your voice is very necessary in marketing this thing. So use all social platforms, get your friends and family on board, and make sure that we all get a chance to read that book or read that story or whatever project you're producing.
That's powerful. Definitely love that point about you're the voice and you have to be responsible for it, and definitely get it out there, because a book isn't a book unless someone reads it. So there is definitely a partnership with the readers, and you have to play your part in terms of getting the book out there. Now, on the book club, we always want to give the author a chance to do a reading from her book, to honor that whole aspect of you just finding your voice and establishing it through this book, and beginning this journey with the public and the readership. So we always ask you to pick an excerpt that you believe women need to hear right now. So what have you chosen for us today?
Okay, so I've chosen an excerpt that relates to the violence that you were alluding to earlier, and I shall begin. In later years in my adulthood, I read a damning report by a professor on the scale of violence against women in Zimbabwe. The study was based on data collected between 1988 and 1990, and the report grimly estimated that women were beaten by their partners in 6 out of 10 homes. That 60% of women suffered violence at the hands of an intimate partner was reprehensible, and that the violence continued to exact its emotional toll on the survivor long after the abuse ended was unimaginable. self-inflicted, self-sabotaging traits would remain evident, as did other forms of dysfunction, which I saw in her. What she needed most was social support and supportive therapy in her journey to healing, in the aftermath of the horror of the violence that she had suffered at the hands of her husband. And yet, all she feared was the judgment that she knew would come if people knew, and so she kept her painful secret well hidden. I realized much later that her instinct to withdraw from the world was not just her way of securing her painful past from exposure, but it was also a symptom of something much deeper and more sinister, her loss of self-esteem.
Wow, yeah. The wounds of violence definitely take away more or have deeper pain that lasts much longer than when the bruises fade.
Indeed.
Very, very powerful. And I love how you linked that to the social statistics to show us that this is an endemic problem. And this is actually systemic, and we need to deal with it on a societal level. We can't just be like, that's happening in someone's home or in someone's life. It's actually happening to a whole gender. It's happening to a generation and generations, and being passed on from generations to generations. Just before we wrap up, can you tell us very quickly if you have a next project brewing?
Yes, indeed. I do have a next project brewing. I'm actually at the research stage right now. So this one is also still a memoir, and it's an intergenerational story spanning 3 generations. It's a story about pride, purpose, and legacy, and I think that's all I'm privileged to say at this point.
Well, we can't wait for that book to come out, and when it does, we'll definitely be amongst the first to review it, and hopefully we'll be able to get you back on here so we can have another insightful conversation. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, bringing life to Zimbabwean stories and helping us as Zimbabweans see ourselves. I think it's a long time coming. I feel like most of our stories stopped at a particular time in history, and we really need the new stories to come up. And what I love about what you're doing with this art form of memoir is that you're still connecting us to those older stories, but you're bringing us into the present, and now you're starting to have a conversation about a future we can all co-create. And voices like yours and books like yours are an important aspect of that journey. So thank you very much, Ruramai.
Thank you, Selena. It was wonderful.
Well, it's been another great edition of the Book Club, and we are so happy that you joined us. We will be back with you same time next week with another fabulous African female author. Until then, stay true, stay free, and stay safe.